Welcome back to the deep dive. Every now and then we got to go back and revisit some truly pivotal moments, those turning points that really shaped the course of history. And today, well, we're setting our sights on December 1775 and the Battle of Quebec.
Yeah, December 1775. I mean, this is a big one. It's not just some small skirmish. This was a bold, a really ambitious attempt by the Continental Army to wrest control of Quebec City from the British.
It really was. And I think for a lot of people, this battle might get overshadowed by some of the bigger, more well-known clashes of the Revolution. But understanding this one, well, it's kind of like getting a backstage pass to the early struggles, the strategic miscalculations, and the incredibly complex dynamics that were at play in those early years.
Totally. It's a window into, like you said, those early struggles, and it really sets the stage for understanding, I think, how the rest of the war unfolded.
Yeah, absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're really fortunate to have a treasure trove of historical accounts to draw from, giving us those firsthand perspectives, the strategic insights, and the human drama that unfolded both on and off the battlefield. So we're going to try and piece all of that together, give you a clear picture of what went down, why it mattered so much, and how it reverberated throughout the rest of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many fascinating layers to this, right? From the military tactics to the political machinations to the really diverse cast of characters involved, both on the American and the British side. And of course, we can't forget the indigenous nations who are also deeply impacted by these events and whose roles are often, I think, underappreciated.
Absolutely. So before we even get to the battle itself, let's rewind a bit. How did we even end up with an American army knocking on Quebec's door in the first place? What were some of those key events that set this whole thing in motion?
Well, you've got to go back to those early sparks of rebellion. I mean, think about the capture of Fort Ticonderoga by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold back in May of 75.
Right. That was a huge morale boost for the Americans, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They seized a crucial strategic fort and all of its artillery from the British, and they did it with minimal casualties.
Yeah, and it was a real symbolic victory, too. I mean, showing that these colonists could actually stand up to the might of the British Empire.
Yeah, and then shortly after that, you have Arnold leading this audacious raid on Fort Saint-Jean up in Quebec. That's got to raise some eyebrows on both sides.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, on the American side, it kind of fueled this growing sense of, well, maybe we could push this further north. Maybe there's an opportunity here. And then for the British, it's a wake-up call. They're starting to realize that this isn't just some localized uprising. It could potentially spill over into their Canadian territories.
Which, of course, is where Governor Guy Carleton enters the picture. He's the guy in charge of Quebec. And these early American actions, well, they don't go unnoticed. He starts taking steps to bolster Quebec's defenses.
Yeah, Carlton, he's definitely a key figure here. And it's actually kind of surprising when you look back at it, just how thinly stretched British forces were in Canada at that time. I mean, we're talking about just 3 regiments spread across this vast territory.
I know. It really highlights the challenges they were facing, trying to maintain control over such a huge area with limited resources. And of course, on top of that, they have to consider the question of loyalty, both from the local Canadian militia and the various indigenous tribes.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because both the British and the Americans, I think they both made some pretty fundamental miscalculations about the people who were already living there.
It's almost like a classic case of projecting your own worldview onto a completely different situation.
Yeah, exactly. Like the British, for example, they kind of assumed that the French-speaking habitants, the majority of the population in Quebec at the time, well, they would just naturally side with the crown, right? They figured, look, the seigneurs, the wealthy landowners, they're loyal to the British. The Catholic Church is generally on side, so the habitants, the tenant farmers, they'll just follow suit.
And then on the flip side, you have the Americans who are all fired up with this revolutionary spirit. They're thinking, hey, these Canadians, they're under British rule. They must be yearning for freedom just like us. We'll show up, liberate them, and they'll welcome us with open arms.
Right, and that's a pretty simplistic view, right? I mean, the reality on the ground in Quebec was way more nuanced than either side really understood. I mean, what's fascinating is that the habitants, they were tenant farmers, but they did have a pretty strong sense of independence. They weren't just going to blindly follow the seigneurs or the church.
They had their own priorities, their own concerns, and they weren't necessarily eager to get caught in the crossfire of this conflict between two empires.
Exactly. They mostly just wanted to be left alone to farm their land and live their lives. And some of them, I mean, there were some who even harbored hopes of a return to French rule, maybe under Louis VI. So Both sides were operating under these faulty assumptions, and it really highlights, I think, that cultural disconnect, that failure to truly understand the complex reality of Quebecois society.
And then, of course, you have the indigenous nations who add yet another layer of complexity to this whole equation. After Pontiac's War, just over a decade before the Revolution, there was a lot of distrust, a lot of resentment towards the British, and frankly, towards all white people. So they were understandably hesitant to get involved in this conflict.
Yeah, for the most part, they were just trying to navigate this incredibly turbulent period, preserve their own sovereignty, their own lands, and they weren't going to just blindly side with either the British or the Americans. Now, there were exceptions, of course. Some groups within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, they did align themselves with the British. But for the most part, indigenous nations were just trying to survive and protect their own interests.
Right, and all of this really underscores that those early American and British perceptions of Canada, they were often based on these really simplistic and frankly inaccurate assumptions. I mean, the Americans, for instance, they seem to have completely underestimated how content a lot of the Canadians were with the Quebec Act of 1774.
Yeah, the Quebec Act. It's ironic because, I mean, that very act, which gave the Canadians greater religious freedom and restored French civil law, I mean, it actually generated a good deal of goodwill towards the British Crown, especially among the habitants.
Which probably wasn't the outcome that the British were necessarily expecting. But in any case, despite all of these miscalculations, all of this uncertainty, the Americans, they still went ahead and formulated a plan to invade Canada. Initially, the Continental Congress, they were hesitant, but eventually they gave the green light with the caveat that the invasion should only happen if General Schuyler, the commander of the Northern Department, thought it was absolutely necessary.
Right. And it's at this point that Benedict Arnold, a man known for his, shall we say, ambition, really starts to push for a more aggressive approach. I mean, he convinces Washington to approve a second expedition aimed directly at Quebec City. And this one, it's going to be a grueling march through the wilderness of Maine.
Yeah, this is where we start to see that two-pronged attack strategy taking shape. Schuyler, who's later replaced by Montgomery, is going to head north towards Montreal via Lake Champlain, and then you have Arnold, who's going to take this incredibly challenging route through Maine.
And while Montgomery's part of the plan actually unfolds relatively quickly, I mean, he manages to capture Montreal in November of 75, Arnold's journey, well, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, it's less of a military campaign and more of a survival epic, right? I mean, he sets out with about 1,100 men, but by the time they reach Quebec, they're down to around 600. Well, Carleton, he's definitely not sitting idly by. He initially views Montreal as the more vulnerable point, but as the scale of the American ambitions becomes clear, his focus shifts to Quebec City. In June of 75, he declares martial law, and while he's confident in the loyalty of the seigneurs and the church, he's less certain about the habitants.
And it's interesting, he even declines an offer of a large indigenous raiding party, thinking that they might be too difficult to control, although he does utilize some indigenous scouts.
Yeah, he's definitely walking a tightrope, trying to balance his limited resources, manage these uncertain loyalties, and prepare for a potential American attack. And while Carleton is focused on Montreal, Lieutenant Governor Hector Cramahe, he's the one who's left in charge of Quebec City. And he seems pretty pessimistic about the local militia. I mean, he makes several attempts to get reinforcements from Boston, but it's just not happening.
Yeah, and it's not just external threats they're dealing with. Remember Ethan Allen, the guy who captured Ticonderoga? Well, he actually tries to take Montreal, but his attempt fails.
Yeah, and there's this interesting episode where they arrest Thomas Walker, who's suspected of being an American sympathizer. So they're definitely on edge, looking for any signs of potential trouble.
And all the while, the American forces are getting closer. They managed to capture Fort St. Jean after a siege, which is a significant setback for the British.
Yeah, and what's striking is how different the recruitment efforts were on both sides. The Americans, they really struggled to enlist Canadians. I mean, one recruiter only managed to get about 40 men. Carleton's strategy, while being mostly defensive, actually gave some Canadians the impression that the British might actually lose, which didn't exactly inspire confidence.
And then you have these American appointed officials in Montreal, guys like Wooster and Walker, and their actions actually end up alienating a lot of the Canadians. They make these really unpopular anti-Catholic moves, which, I mean, in a place like Quebec, it's a pretty disastrous strategy.
It's like they're shooting themselves in the foot. But then when news of Arnold's approach reaches Quebec City, you actually do see an increase in militia enlistments. So there's this mix of fear, loyalty, and maybe even a bit of opportunism at play.
And just in time, right, because Carleton himself returns to Quebec City, takes command, and issues this proclamation saying, look, everybody who's able-bodied, you got to take up arms or you're going to be considered a rebel. This is a pretty bold move, and it seems to have worked. About 500 inhabitants end up joining the defense effort.
So Carleton, he's strengthening the city's defenses, he's rallying the population, and he's getting ready for a showdown with Arnold. And Arnold, well, he finally arrives at Clintleys just across the river from Quebec City. And his troops, they're in pretty rough shape after that brutal march through the wilderness.
They're exhausted, they're under-equipped, they're lacking artillery, but they're still determined to press on.
Yeah, and a storm actually delays their crossing of the St. Lawrence. Eventually, they manage to land at Wolf's Cove and move on to the Plains of Abraham. I mean, it's a pretty symbolic location, considering the history of that site.
Definitely. And just the state of Arnold's troops, it really highlights the toll of that journey. Their uniforms are in tatters, they're low on ammunition, they don't even have proper artillery.
But despite all of that, Arnold, he still makes this bold demand for the city's surrender. And the British, well, their response is pretty unequivocal. They basically open fire on his envoys.
They're not messing around, and during a council of war, Alan McLean, who's this experienced Highlander, he really pushes for holding out. He argues that they have enough men, enough supplies to withstand a siege.
And Arnold, realizing that a direct assault would be suicidal at this point, he decides to try and blockade the city. But maintaining that blockade proves to be a challenge, especially with rumors going around about a potential British counterattack.
And then, just when things are looking pretty grim for Arnold, Montgomery shows up with reinforcements and some much-needed supplies, including artillery.
That's got to be a huge relief for Arnold and his men.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they were really running out of options, but it's important to remember Arnold himself wasn't universally loved by his own officers. There was some tension there.
Yeah, Arnold's personality could be, well, let's just say it rubs some people the wrong way.
Yeah, he could be a bit abrasive. But anyway, with their forces combined, they initiate a formal siege of Quebec on December 6th.
And Montgomery, he tries this psychological tactic. He sends multiple demands for surrender to Carleton, but Carleton, he's having none of it. He reportedly burns those letters unread.
He's not even giving them the courtesy of a response. And the Americans, they also try to win over the local population. You know, they spread propaganda promising a brighter future under American rule.
Right, they're trying to appeal to the Canadians, but it's a tough sell, especially after those missteps by Worcester and Walker.
And Carleton, in the meantime, he's busy organizing his defenses, putting experienced officers in charge of key sectors. The British, they start fortifying the lower town, while the Americans, they start bombarding the city and deploying snipers.
So it's this tense standoff, and for the Americans, there's this ticking clock because a lot of Montgomery's men, their enlistments are set to expire at the end of December.
Yeah, that looming deadline really adds a sense of urgency to their actions.
Yeah.
And their artillery battery, it's not as effective as they'd hoped. The frozen ground makes it difficult to position the guns properly.
In Montgomery, he's realizing that they're in a tough spot. They're outnumbered. They don't have the heavy weapons they need for a prolonged siege, and time is running out.
So he comes up with this risky plan, a surprise attack during a nighttime snowstorm. The idea is to use the cover of the storm to scale the walls undetected.
It's a bold gamble, but it's also incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, if it works, it could be a brilliant move, but if it fails, well, the consequences could be catastrophic.
And it's interesting, you have this local figure, Christophe Pellissier. He owns an ironworks, and he actually sympathizes with the American cause. He offers to provide them with munitions.
Yeah, he's kind of a wild card in this whole situation. And he advises against holding a provincial convention until Quebec is secured, believing that a decisive American victory would sway public opinion.
So they're getting ready for this nighttime assault, and on December 27th, a snowstorm hits, which seems like a perfect opportunity, but then it subsides and they have to postpone.
And then disaster strikes. One of their sergeants, he deserts and goes straight to the British with their battle plans.
I mean, talk about a crushing blow. Their entire plan is now compromised.
Yeah, it's a major setback. Montgomery is forced to come up with a new plan on the fly. This time he decides on 2 feints against the western walls and 2 actual attacks on the lower town. Arnold's going to lead one from the north, and Montgomery will attack along the St. Lawrence River.
So it's a much more complicated plan, with multiple moving parts all happening under the cover of a blizzard.
Exactly, and they're hoping that if they can capture the lower town, the old subject merchants who live in the upper town, well, they'll pressure Carleton to surrender. It's a bit of a long shot, but it's their best option at this point.
And this revised plan, it's a closely guarded secret. Only the most senior officers are aware of it.
They can't afford any more leaks. And then finally, on December 30th, another heavy snowstorm hits, and Montgomery gives the order to attack.
So, under the cover of this blinding blizzard, the American assault begins. Brown and Livingston, they go to their designated positions and fire their signal flares.
And then Montgomery and Arnold, they launch their separate attacks on the lower town. It's chaos, the wind is howling, the snow is coming down sideways, visibility is almost zero.
Montgomery, he's personally leading his men down this treacherous path from Wolf's Cove. The snow is thick, the ground is icy, and the darkness is almost complete.
And the British, they're not caught completely off guard. I mean, the ringing of church bells alerts them to the attack, and then they spot these faint lights, the lanterns of the advancing Americans.
Montgomery's men, they reach the first defensive palisade and start hacking away at it with saws. Montgomery himself is right there in the thick of it, urging his men forward.
But as they push on, they come under heavy fire from the defenders. They're caught in this narrow street, trapped between houses, and the British are pouring musket fire and grape shot into their ranks.
And in a moment that changes everything, Montgomery, he's struck and killed instantly by cannon fire.
It's a devastating blow for the Americans. Their commander is gone, and their attack on that front, it basically collapses.
Meanwhile, Arnold, he's leading his men towards the Sault-au-Matelot, where there are these heavy barricades. They manage to get past some of the outer defenses undetected, but as they get closer to the palace gate, the British open up on them with everything they've got.
They're pinned down by this intense fire from the city walls, and the 6-pounder cannon they brought with them, it gets stuck in the deep snow. They have to abandon it.
And to make matters worse, they get lost in the maze of narrow streets within the lower town. It's a blizzard, it's dark, they're unfamiliar with the layout, and it just adds to the confusion and chaos.
They finally stumble upon another heavily defended barricade, manned by Canadian militia and equipped with light cannons. Arnold, he's trying to organize an attack, but then he's hit in the leg by musket fire. He's down, severely wounded.
So command falls to Daniel Morgan, who's known for his tenacity and his leadership. He's got to rally the troops and figure out what to do next.
Yeah, Morgan, he's a tough, resourceful guy. Despite Arnold being down, he manages to lead 2 successful assaults on the barricade, capturing it after some fierce hand-to-hand fighting.
But their advance is slowed. The narrow streets are making it difficult to maneuver, and their gunpowder is damp from the snow, causing a lot of misfires.
And this delay, it proves to be crucial because Carleton, back in the city, he realizes what's happening. He sees that the attacks on the upper town gates were just diversions, and he starts redirecting his forces to the lower town where the real fighting is taking place.
And it's at this point that Colonel Alan Maclean, he assembles this mixed force of British regulars, Highlanders, sailors, Canadian militia, and they head out to intercept Arnold's men.
They clash with Morgan's men at a second major barricade. There's this tense standoff, and then, in a moment of defiance, Morgan actually shoots and kills a British sailor who's demanding their surrender.
It's a bold move, but it also means that there's no turning back now.
Yeah, things are escalating quickly. Morgan and his men, they capture that second barricade, but now they're facing heavy fire from houses occupied by British troops and militia.
And then, a British force sallies out from the palace gate, cutting off Morgan's retreat. A relief force under Major Dearborn tries to come to their aid, but they're ambushed and forced to surrender.
They're tracked, surrounded, and their situation is becoming increasingly desperate. They're running out of ammunition, they're outnumbered, and there's no sign of reinforcements.
Morgan's men, they put up a valiant fight, but in the end, they're forced to surrender. And it's a symbolic moment when Morgan surrenders his sword to a Catholic priest.
It's a gesture of respect, I think, amidst the chaos and bloodshed. And with that, the Battle of Quebec effectively comes to an end.
It's a crushing defeat for the Americans. They lose about 50 men killed, 34 wounded, and over 400 captured, including most of Arnold's remaining force.
And the loss of leadership is just as devastating. Montgomery is dead, Arnold is severely wounded, and Daniel Morgan, he's a prisoner. In contrast, the British, they only suffer a handful of casualties.
It's a stark reminder of the risks involved in this invasion, the challenges they were facing, and the unpredictable nature of war.
Yeah, and for the Americans, it's a major setback, both strategically and in terms of morale.
So Montgomery's body is recovered by the British and given a proper military funeral. Later, his remains are returned to New York. Arnold, he's left with a drastically reduced force, barely 600 men, to continue what becomes this increasingly hopeless siege of Quebec.
And he's stuck there throughout the brutal Canadian winter. General Wooster, who's now in command of the Northern Department, refuses to send significant reinforcements from Montreal.
And Washington, back in the colonies, he's frustrated. He's dealing with the constant problem of short-term enlistments. The Continental Army, it's still very much a work in progress.
It's a lot of, hey, can you stay for another 3 months? Not exactly a recipe for military success.
Right, I mean, they're trying to fight a war against a global superpower with an army that's constantly rotating its personnel.
And the situation in Quebec, it's just getting worse. Disease is rampant, particularly smallpox, and they're running out of supplies. There are even accounts of Carleton deliberately releasing smallpox-infected civilians into the American camp.
It's brutal. I mean, it highlights the grim realities of warfare in that era.
It does, and the Americans, their reliance on paper money also backfires. The local merchants, they prefer hard currency, so the Americans are forced to start requisitioning supplies, which alienates the Canadians even further.
So Worcester, he's replaced by General Thomas in April, but the situation remains dire. Carleton, meanwhile, he's learned from past mistakes. He decides to avoid attacking the American camp directly. He figures, let the winter, the disease, the lack of supplies, let those things take their toll.
It's a strategy of attrition, and it seems to be working.
There are some minor loyalist actions against the Americans in the surrounding area, but nothing that really changes the overall strategic situation. The Americans do manage to briefly shell Quebec City once the St. Lawrence River thaws, but it has minimal impact.
And then you have this congressional commission, which includes Benjamin Franklin, Father John Carroll. They go up to Quebec to try and rally support for the American cause, but public opinion has turned against them.
Yeah, the actions of Worcester and Walker, they've really poisoned the well. And Father Carroll, he's a Catholic priest, but even he struggles to gain the support of the Canadian clergy.
They see the Americans as a threat to their way of life, to their religious freedom.
So General Thomas, he realizes that the siege is a lost cause, and he starts preparing for a retreat. But it turns into a chaotic mess when British reinforcements arrive in May.
They're completely routed, and tragically, General Thomas, he dies of smallpox during the retreat. It's a grim end to an ill-fated campaign.
So the remaining American forces, they limp back to Fort Ticonderoga, defeated and demoralized.
And Carleton, he doesn't just sit back and watch them go. He launches a counteroffensive and wins a naval victory at the Battle of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain.
Right, but Arnold, he leads a skillful rearguard action that prevents the British from advancing any further south that year.
So Carleton, after the Americans are driven out, he orders this survey to identify any Canadians who supported the rebellion. They find over 700 individuals.
Yeah, and initially, they're pretty lenient with these people, but once the threat is gone, they crack down harder, imposing forced labor and other punishments.
Yeah.
It's a way of making sure that there's no lingering support for the American cause.
Yeah, they're sending a message. Don't even think about siding with the rebels.
And despite the overall failure of the invasion, it's worth noting that some Canadians, they do continue to fight for the American cause throughout the war. They join the Continental Army, they fight in battles further south.
They're committed to the ideals of the revolution, even after this major setback in their own homeland.
And the British, they actually send a massive force to Quebec in 1776 under General Burgoyne. Over 9,000 soldiers, including German auxiliaries. It's a huge logistical undertaking, and it puts a lot of strain on the local population.
And Carleton's command, it actually comes under scrutiny back in London. They think he was a bit too cautious, not aggressive enough, and it leads to Burgoyne being given command of the 1777 invasion of New York.
Yeah, Burgoyne's campaign, of course, ends in disaster at Saratoga, which is a major turning point in the war. And the Americans, after their victory at Saratoga, they briefly consider launching another invasion of Canada, but they just don't have the resources.
Plus, Quebec City, it's a fortress. It would be a costly and risky endeavor. So the idea of invading Canada, it keeps coming up in discussions, but it never really gets off the ground.
And during the peace negotiations in 1782-83, the Americans, they actually ask for Canada to be ceded to them, but the British, they're not having any of it.
And the Americans, they hadn't actually managed to hold any significant territory in Canada, so their claim was pretty weak.
It's interesting to think about how different things might have been if that invasion had succeeded. I mean, would Canada be part of the United States today?
Yeah, it's a big what if question. Maybe those peace negotiations would have gone differently. Maybe the whole map of North America would look different. It's all speculation, of course.
But it does show how crucial that early stage of the war was, how close things were.
And it's worth remembering that the legacy of that campaign, it's still present today. I mean, there are National Guard units in the U.S. whose lineage can be traced back to the American units that fought at Quebec.
So as we wrap this up, I think it's clear that the Battle of Quebec, it was more than just a military defeat. It was a pivotal moment that really exposed those early American weaknesses, those strategic miscalculations, and the complexities of trying to wage war in this vast, unfamiliar territory with these shifting alliances.
Totally. And for me, some of the most striking takeaways are first, just how devastating that wilderness march was for Arnold's forces. I mean, it really crippled them before they even reached Quebec City.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole issue of misreading the Canadians, those assumptions on both the British and the American side about how they would react. And of course, the death of Montgomery, the wounding of Arnold. I mean, those were huge turning points that really swung the battle in favor of the British.
And it all leaves us with this really intriguing question. What if things had gone differently at Quebec? What if the Americans had managed to capture the city? Or if the Canadians had overwhelmingly embraced their cause?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that really gets to the heart of what we try to do here on the Deep Dive. We explore these pivotal moments in history. We look in the decisions that were made, the factors that were at play, and we ask ourselves, what if? What if things had gone differently? How would that have shaped the world we live in today?
And that's something for all of you out there to ponder, to research further, to let your imaginations run wild with. Because history, it's not just a collection of dates and names. It's a story of choices, of consequences, and of endless possibilities.
It definitely makes you wonder about all those turning points, those sliding doors moments that could have sent history down a completely different path. But that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
We get to explore those possibilities, to imagine those alternate realities, and to appreciate the incredible complexity of the past.
So, until next time, keep diving deep into those historical mysteries, keep asking those what-if questions, and we'll see you back here for another deep dive into the past.
Always a pleasure, and thanks for joining us.
And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll catch you next time.